Good morning. The elders had mentioned that this Saturday morning is a little bit more interactive, which is a really kind way of saying we'd like to hear a little less of you, Scott. But I will tell you, I like interactive things, but it all really depends on the group. So if you are willing to interact with me, it becomes interactive. If I ask questions and you stare at me like I'm a dead fish, then it isn't. So I'm going to need your help. That's what I'm trying to say. So the key verse for this morning is Micah chapter 6. And Micah chapter 6 verses 6 through 8. Let's look at 6 and 7 first. So what we'll do is we'll look at a few verses and then kind of pause to contemplate those and then continue from there. So, with what shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before the God on high? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Micah, as a prophet to the Jewish nation, in fact, he was a prophet to the southern kingdom after the split. He is talking to them about how they were, in fact, a very religious society. This is one of the things that we sometimes forget, is that being religious is not the same as being Christian. It's not the same as being godly. And that the vast majority of human beings on this planet are religious. And so Micah begins this discourse of talking about all these different things that you could do to try and make God happy. Well, what could I do to please God on high? Well, I could offer burnt offerings. Well, that sounds good. How about yearling calves? So we'll make sure that they're really high quality. And then it kind of goes to ad absurdum, right? Well, what about 1,000 rams? If one is good, how about 1,000? How about 10,000 rivers of oil, right? Not something you could even practically do. And then he goes to particularly absurd, where he says, well, what if I just offered my own child? You know, firstborn, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul. What if I just began to sacrifice people? And that sounds crazy, and it's meant to sound crazy, but the sad truth is have religions ever done that, where they sacrifice children? Yeah. What are some examples of crazy things that people have done in the name of religion? I'll tell you a story of one that I have at the end, but I'm sure that you have all probably experienced talking to people, and there are some rather absurd or odd things that they did in the name of serving God. Or some crazy things.
Certain followers of Molech would burn their children in the bronze bowl, I believe.
Yeah, so that's absolutely under the time of the Old Testament. They began to worship Molech as one of the false gods, and they would have these bronze statues of him, and they would heat it up like a furnace. And it's just hard to even talk about, but they would take their children and lay them in the arms of Molech, this bronze idol that was heated up. And, as you can imagine, the child died. So that was a form of child sacrifice. Any other ones that you've heard of, or even more modern ones? Yeah?
I think in our current society, we hear stories on the news where somebody might become a martyr, blow themselves up, or whatever, in the name of religion.
There you go. Yeah, that certainly gets done in the name of religion today. The suicide bomber and the idea of, if I do this, then Allah will be pleased with my sacrifice and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a case of sacrificing your own body and killing other people, in fact. So yeah, any others?
I think of that. Remember the Greek temples had their temple prostitution. So even married couples would offer themselves as prostitutes in the name of whatever false god they were worshiping at the temple.
Yeah.
As a way of bringing in money for that temple.
Yeah, absolutely. So, any odd forms of religious worship that you've heard of? That maybe even more modern ones, where you say, "Oh, I didn't know people did that."
You mean grabbing snakes?
Yeah, there's one, like grabbing snakes. That doesn't come up too often anymore, but there are people who do the snake handling thing. And they say, well, if God loves us, we can handle these snakes and will not be bitten. There's one my wife ran into one time. I was there. She was getting her hair cut. She was at a stylist, and it was a new stylist. And so you know how it is. There's a lot of the talking going on, and so just a little chit-chat. And she asked my wife what she did for a living. She said, well, I'm a housewife, and my husband's a minister. And she goes, oh, I just love Jesus. And Jenna says, oh, well, that's wonderful. Where do you go? And she mentioned some sort of community church. She goes, you got to understand, I am a belly dancer. And so at this point, I was reading a book, sitting, just in one of the waiting chairs, and all of a sudden, did I hear that right? And so I look up at my wife, and she's sitting in the chair, and she's facing me, and the stylist is behind her, and she has the same look on her face that I had on mine. So I said, I think I did. She said belly dancer. She goes, yeah, God has just given me the gift of belly dance, and I just love to belly dance for Jesus. So there's an absurd thing that I had heard. And she truly believed that was something that was bringing pleasure to God. And you will sometimes hear things in the news like people who will hang themselves on crosses. This happens more in South America and whatnot, where people will annually go and kind of symbolically hang themselves on a cross to emulate the death of Christ, and they believe that they are pleasing God for that. So there's a lot of things that people do in the name of religion. And that's what Micah is getting at, is here, okay, let's name all these different things I could do, and let's make them bigger and bigger and bigger. But then he ends it in verse 8 with one of the most beautiful passages in all of the Old Testament. He says, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? So we have man's idea of how we serve him. How can I best serve God? And we think big, right? What if I could do this big, giant thing? 1 Corinthians 13 gives a really good example of that when talking about love. If you go to 1 Corinthians 13, he says, what if I sacrifice my body and I have not love? It profits me nothing, right? And what if I give all my money to the poor? And he lists all of these really powerful, massive things, and yet if I don't do this thing called love, all of those have no value. So it turns out that a lot of times the things that we think, this would make me a really good servant of God, in fact, God says, that's not what I'm looking for at all. Right? He's told us what is good. So when we talk about being a disciple of Christ, a student and a follower of Him, that's the goal, is what has He said makes Him happy. And if He says, this makes me happy, and I go, well, wait a second, I'm not sure that that's big enough. Well, Naaman had something to say about that. You remember the story of Naaman? And he was the leprous man in the Old Testament. And he was from Syria. And he came over to Elisha. And Elisha didn't even come out to see him. Naaman wanted to be healed of his leprosy. So Elisha just sent his servant out. And he said, go tell the guy to dip himself in the river Jordan 7 times. And Naaman got really upset about it. Because Naaman was a pretty powerful guy. And it took one of his servants to take and kind of talk him off his high horse and say, you know, if he'd asked you to do some giant thing, to defeat an army or something of that major nature, you would have done it, right? He just asked you to do something simple. Why don't you just do that? And so Naaman listened and went and dipped himself in the Jordan River 7 times, and then he was healed of his leprosy. So it turns out that just because I think I've got a bigger thing that I should do, and that would make God happy, it turns out a lot of times that has nothing to do with it. It's about what He's told us to do that is good. And so we've got to kind of re-engineer our thinking. That's what I want you to see, is that to serve God, we're going to have to think the way He wants us to think, and to do what He thinks is a big deal. Because a lot of times the things that God asks us to do, we think are too small. And unfortunately, then they go undone. Jeremiah 10 says, I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself, that it is not in man who walks to direct his steps. When man goes about the process of creating his own religion, it looks very different than what you find in the New Testament, doesn't it? Right? When the Catholic Church said, let's really amp up and make grand Christianity, they ended up with massive buildings, right? Beautiful architecture and stained glass. Fancy robes and clothing and collars, and then dietary restrictions. If you are a practicing Catholic, like an Orthodox practicing Catholic, you are actually very dedicated in every aspect of your life. But the problem with all of that opulence and detail is it kind of misses the mark, doesn't it? If you walk into a Catholic church building, a cathedral, you're going to get a very great human sense of religious power. But is it what God has told us what is good? We missed it. Yeah.
You know, thinking about even the thing with Naaman, that people keep wanting to do something big for God. They kind of go pagan religion. They don't want to please God who does not have it.
Mm-hmm.
And even the passage in Micah, God is saying, I really want you to be something.
Yes.
I'm looking for you to be something
Mm-hmm.
that's really good.
Yep.
And that requires a humility, because he used the humble word in there. And even what he asked Naaman to do, I mean, it's kind of, in this one sense, humbly. I'm going to just go dip myself in the water, and essentially be baptized, 7 times. It's nothing grand about it. There's nothing big about it. There's nothing you can brag about. And it kind of flies in the face of what humans want to do. And what God's trying to do is change us, not change and not have us do some big grand thing.
Yeah, and you take like Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, when he talked about things like fasting and prayer and giving, financial contribution to the needs of others. How did he ask us to fast, pray, and give? What were the stipulations he put in the Sermon on the Mount? Anybody remember? If you're going to give, how do you do it? What? In secret. Yeah, that's right. You're going to pray in secret, where the only person who's going to see, person with a capital P, right, is God. You're going to give in a way that your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing, so that if anything, you kind of forget you gave. It's like you just do it and you move on. You're not even keeping an account in your own mind of how you've helped other people. You just do it, right? And fasting, if you fast, what was the problem with fasting during that time period? How do people do it?
To be seen.
To be seen, yeah, right. Put on your sackcloth and ashes, and I'm so hungry. Basically look like Scott after missing one meal. And so, the goal is an internal change that may very well, in fact, manifest itself in nobody knowing anything. Right? You're just going about the job of doing what God has said is good. We'll go back to the passage we mentioned, kind of used as a key verse last night. When Paul spoke to Timothy, he says, as for you, continue in what you have learned and have firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it, and how from childhood you have been acquainted with the sacred writings, which are able to make you wise for salvation. Through faith in Christ Jesus, all Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, so the man of God may be competent, equipped for every good work. So that terminology of equipped for every good work, what we find is that if I want to know what is good, I'm going to have to go back to those sacred writings, the Scripture. We talked about sacred last night, so we won't spend a lot of time on that. But that those things they'll make you wise for salvation, and they will equip you. Well, equip is a powerful word because it's something that kind of is tangible. Anybody here work in at a job that would be considered the trades. Anybody in the trades whatsoever? Are you all tech geeks here? Is that what it is? Trades? Okay. So what in particular do you do? Right behind you.
I work in the printing.
Printing industry? Okay, so if I walked into the printing industry, I would imagine there's some equipment there that you're going to use. It doesn't just pop out of thin air. We haven't gotten to that point yet, have we? So when you talk about manufacturing something, so that's essentially what you're in, right? Is the manufacturing of printed material. You're going to have equipment to do it right. Poor equipment produces a poor product. So to here, if we're not equipped properly, we're not going to do good works. Well, Micah says God has told us what is good, right? So if I want to do good work, I have to equip myself with the knowledge of what God actually says is good. And now you're back to what Roger said, which is I've got to make an internal change. I can't stand around waiting to do this big thing for God. What I actually need to do is just get up in the morning and do whatever thing is right in front of me, and that's the big thing. The big thing is the thing that you have right there in front of you. Jesus mentioned it in terms of he who is faithful in little is faithful in much, right? So you start with the little and then you work to the much. We tend to do the opposite. We wait for that big thing. Husbands are a great example of this. I would die for my wife. Now, taking out the trash, I'm not sure we're going to do that. But I would die. I'd take a bullet for her, right? I'll tell you, taking a bullet's fine, but there's a very high probability you'll never have to do that. But maybe helping with the dishes, or taking out the trash, or writing her a little card, or remembering your anniversary, these sorts of things, they will have a much bigger impact on your marriage, right? I mean, that's the classic male example. Well, do you tell your wife you love her? Oh, she knows that. She knows. Yeah, she might want to hear it every once in a while, right? So we understand in marriages in particular that acts of small kindness and goodness are, in fact, a lot more powerful sometimes than some gigantic act. So let's look at the things that he says are he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. So he has three things: do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. Right? Okay, so we'll do those three things all, break them each down. Justice is this idea of doing the right thing. So Exodus chapter 23 is just one of many places you could go to. In fact, be thinking as we read through this passage in Exodus 23 of other examples of just things that God told the Jewish people to do with their neighbor. Because the Old Testament in particular has a lot of very practical examples of what to do in your interaction with your fellow men that are the right thing to do. But Exodus 23 says, "You shall not follow the masses in doing evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after a multitude in order to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute." That's kind of an interesting one because it talks about being partial to a poor person. Normally we think about being partial to a rich person, but you can go the other way too. Actually, you go, oh, well, that guy's got it so bad, why don't we just, give him the verdict in the case, even though he doesn't really have a good point there. That's where we said, well, this guy over here's got so much money, what's the point? Why not just give a little bit to the poor man? He says, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. If you see the donkey wanting to hate you, lying helpless under its load, you shall refrain from leaving it to him. You shall surely release it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. Keep far from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted, subverts the cause of the just. You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you also were strangers in the land of Egypt. So you have this description of all of these things that are acts of justice. And we've taken a lot of those ideas over to the American court systems. When you talk about depictions of Lady Justice. She's got the scales, and how is she almost always depicted? In fact, I could probably go back and you could see her there. What's the interesting thing about the depiction of Lady Justice? She's blindfolded. Why? No partiality, equality, and justice. That's right. Justice ought to not care who's involved, right? It just says what's right is what's right because it is right. And it doesn't matter who it is, and it doesn't matter the circumstance. It doesn't matter if I don't like the guy. It doesn't matter if we've been friends a long time. So what are some Old Testament examples of things that God had told the Jews to do that were the right thing to do? I'll give you one example, maybe prime the pump a little bit. Are things like what is mentioned here in Exodus 23, where he says, if you see your enemy's donkey and it's lying helpless, what do? You take care of it, even though it's your enemy's. So that's a practical day-by-day example of it. Any other Old Testament examples you can think of? Or modern ones, I guess, would work too. You say, well, this is just the right thing to do. Yeah. Oh, the corners of the field. Yeah, that's right. So the corners of the field in the Old Testament, God said, as you glean and harvest your field, you leave the corners for who? For the poor. And that was just the right thing to do. Yeah.
Have you heard on the news just in the last couple of days, a bunch of money fell off of a Brinks truck, and so it was just flying all over people, rushing in to scoop it up. The FBI was saying, you have to return that, and if you don't return it, we can prosecute you. Of course, they don't have a lot of great cameras, and how they get about how much people picked up.
Right.
The right thing to do is return that money. It's not yours. I think in America we think, how many of us believe they'll get half of that money back?
Right. No, that's a great example of it, right? And they do things, I remember like 2020 and Dateline used to do similar things where they do a test and somebody would give the wrong change. They would plant a cashier who would give $50 instead of $5 in change. And how many times did people just walk out with the $50? Free money, right? And that's not just. So that's a great example of it. Any other examples you can think of people not doing the right thing? Taxes, right? Yeah. They're right there. Yeah, doing the right thing. Why does that matter? Why does it matter that you, as a Christian, pay your taxes properly? Now, you can take your deductions because that's legal, right? It's legal to take your deductions. But don't take my deductions, too, right? And don't take some extra deductions. Why should that matter to us? I mean, after all, the U.S. government has got so much money, right?
Well, no government exists without the authority of God allowing it to.
Okay.
And so we are honoring God by respecting the establishment that He put in power.
Perfect, yeah. So you have Jesus saying things like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. You have Romans, I think it's 12, that points out the idea that every authority is in there because God has allowed them to be in there and God's put them in that position. So it is an act of us honoring God to obey that. And what would it say about Christians if one of us got caught up in tax fraud and made the 5 o'clock news? Right? It would reflect poorly on the Lord. So justice is the act of simply saying, I will do what is right regardless of credit, regardless of who benefits from it. Right? If my enemy benefits from me doing the right thing, I guess that's just the way it goes. Right? A good example of that was David. Remember David hiding in the cave and then Saul came into the cave? And David understood Saul was king. So per our previous point that you just made about the rulers, so if Saul's king, who made Saul king? God. So David, he's running for his life because Saul is being unjust, right? Saul is attempting to kill David. And so David's hiding in this cave and all of his mighty men who are with him say, now's your chance. Kill him. So David creeps up and he cuts a corner of his robe off. And then afterwards, David actually even felt bad about doing that. Cutting a corner of his garment off and kind of making this shameful humiliation of the king. He felt even bad for that. And now, who was the better man, Saul or David? Definitely David, right? Saul was not a just king. Did that affect David's value of doing the right thing? No, that's what makes David better, right? We got to take the high road. We've got to take the road that God intended. That's a large part of what God intends, is to do justice. Now, you notice, as we talked about these things, how many of these things are big things? They're mostly everyday things, right? They're, hey, I ran into your car in the parking lot and I'm not going to drive off without leaving a note. I'll leave a note, my insurance information, those sorts of things. That's not a big thing, but it does stand out in a society where how many times do people, scrape up somebody else's car in the parking lot and just drive away because nobody noticed. Or the classic, I'm going to write a note so that people who are watching will think but all I wrote is sorry, and then drove off. So it's not a big thing, but it does stand out. Anybody else have anything there on the subject of justice? Yes?
Doing the right thing. I'm always struck by soldiers in when they are honored for doing some heroic thing. And just almost every single time I've ever heard it, they talk about they just did their job.
Yeah.
And it became a heroic deed and thing because they followed the training and the rules and just did their job. And it turned out, they were doing their job all the time, all these little times, and we don't notice 99% of the time. And then one time, it saves a whole bunch of people, and we honor that. And they're like, there's a certain amount of, I don't really want to be honored for that because you're honoring just me, but the whole truth just did their job the whole time. I just happened to be in that one spot at that one time to do the thing that saved a bunch of people.
Yeah, the greatness of it is really, you find with those heroes, is that the circumstance dictated the greatness, but they were just doing the same thing they'd done all the other days, and you kind of have this Esther moment, right? If you are doing the right thing all the time, then all of a sudden you have this Esther moment where Mordecai says to her, for such a time as this, maybe this is your moment, but you have to be the right kind of person all the rest of the time leading up to that, prepared for every good work. And Paul told that to Timothy, is that we should be vessels prepared for every good work. You don't necessarily get to dictate what the work is, right? You just have to be ready for whatever it is, and the training kicks in, and you're equipped for whatever that work happens to be. The circumstances will dictate that. So that's a great point. So from there you move to love kindness. And so if we're going to love kindness, we've moved beyond doing what's just. Just is what's right. Kindness is what's beyond fair. So I have here a picture of a man opening a door for a woman. Is she capable of opening that door herself? As far as I can tell, her arms aren't broken. She's entirely capable of doing that. And yet, we would all consider when somebody holds the door for another human being the right thing to do. But it's right in a different sense than paying your taxes is right, isn't it? Paying your taxes is about what's just. Holding the door for other people that you see, another 5 steps, or maybe they got their arms full of groceries and whatnot, that's not necessarily required of you by what's fair. What's fair is the door's there and everybody can open it themselves. But it is what's kind. And the ability to do kind things is a whole other level where Christians can now say, I will do what's right, but then I will also love to do things beyond what is fair. And that is a hallmark of Christianity, because after all, what is fair as far as God's relationship with you? You sin, and what's the fair thing? What's the wage? That's fair. Wages are fair. You've earned it. What's the wage of sin? It's death, right? So the fair thing would be God says, I gave you a chance. You could have lived a perfect life and you could have gone to heaven, but instead you sinned, so you're going to hell. That's fair. But he went beyond that, right? He sent his son to open a door. Yeah.
His going beyond that is, the New Testament calls it grace.
Mm-hmm.
And I've talked about this particular Hebrew word a lot to this church, ased, which is most closely associated with the idea of grace in the New Testament.
Exactly.
Actually, it's translated kindness, goodness, mercy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A whole bunch of different ways that, because it's such a hard thing to translate into English, but it has that concept of, I'm just going to do the gracious thing, like you said, go above and beyond what's required, and I'm just going to do good for you.
Right. It's the idea of offering a gift that was unearned, but you have the ability to do it. Right? It could be something as simple as you're mowing your lawn and your next door neighbor, you know that they've been dealing with some health problems, and so you already got the mower out, so you just kind of continue on over to their yard. That's not fair, but it's beyond fair. It's gracious and merciful. It's a kindness. David did that with the house of Saul. After Saul killed himself, Jonathan died in battle. Essentially, Saul's entire lineage is now gone. David's now king. And David makes the point, he says, is there still anyone left at the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And so Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth, and he was lame in the feet. David brought him in, took care of him, gave him and restored land to him, and said, you sit at my table just because I can be kind. This is something I can do. Not something I have to do, but something I can do. What are other acts of kindness and examples of acts of kindness that we could do in modern life today? We want application, right? I'm not the king. There is no Mephibosheth for me. So what can be our acts of kindness that we as Christians can do to love kindness or grace or mercy? Yeah.
Well, there is an Eve for you.
Yeah. Yes, I do have an Eve. I feel like I've been given more grace in having the Eve than the other way around. But I know what you mean.
It's the idea that you're a child that needs people, and you're able, and you're not required, but you're able, so you do. So that's one of those kinds of things. Providing somebody shelter, giving somebody some money, just maybe buying their meal for them, when they don't require to need to.
So ultimately, the verse he's referring to there can be summed up in James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God is to care for widows and orphans in their distress. What's the common theme between widows and orphans?
Need.
The need, right? Yeah, they're the weakest of society, right? They're babies, the fatherless, and then widows who have no spouse to take care of them. And so they don't have that normal infrastructure that most families do to provide. So these are people at both ends of the spectrum, from young to old, that have needs that we could all easily turn a blind eye to and go on with our life, and nobody would ever blame you. That's the tricky thing about kindness, isn't it? Is if you don't show it, nobody can say that was the wrong thing. But it ultimately was. It's what we would call a sin of omission. I just didn't do it. It wasn't some evil thing I did. It's just I just didn't do this kindness I could do. I remember the story of rich man and Lazarus. What was the problem with the rich man? Was it that he was rich and Lazarus was poor? Was that the problem? No. The Lazarus was laid at the rich man's gate, and what did the rich man do every day? Right in and out, and never did anything for Lazarus. And that was it was a kindness he could have easily shown.
The Good Samaritan, is two Levites, priests and a Levite, walked by this person that's in need,
right,
and beaten up, and a Samaritan doesn't. He helps them out. I mean, we can do that. Just somebody's stranded on the side of the road. I mean, imagine our wife break down, and we see somebody. We want others to help them.
Absolutely.
We have that chance to maybe just take that moment, take a few extra minutes out of our time. Be a little stressed about anyway.
and help somebody who had a need. Yeah.
I think with love and kindness that sometimes we put an expectation on that and that keeps us from doing it. And I'll give you an example, like a homeless person, he might need money. But I think sometimes I've heard people say, well, I'm not giving it to him because he's probably going to go buy booze with it. He might. But if we're doing our act of kindness because that's what's on our heart, well, he does it for money.
Right.
We have no bearing on us. We're just doing our act of kindness.
And you bring up a good point. One, what somebody does with your kindness is kind of secondary, right? But then the second thing is we also rationalize why we shouldn't. You have a homeless person, is giving them $20 the only option available to you? No, there are some other options. You can buy them some food. You could buy them some socks. That's one of the things that I know somebody that's what they do. They buy socks because that's one of those kind of items that homeless people often have a need for, and they are harder to procure for them. And so but those require us to kind of go out of our way, right? So we kind of say, well, I could do the easy thing, which is $20, or I could do the other easy thing, which is nothing. But it's not like there aren't other options in between too. Even if you did have concern about the $20, it's not like that's your only option. And you're right. Even if what they do with it really is secondary as well.
I used to go down, I drove truck for a living, so I went down to San Diego a lot, and there was a homeless community down there, and I used to talk to a lot of them. And there was one guy there, and I tried many times to help him out, and Cindy would make these little food bags, and they just had all sorts of different things for homeless people. And he would never accept them, and I asked him one day, I go, how come you won't accept these gifts? And he goes, because I've been poisoned. He goes, if you give me cash, I can go buy food. So he was turning down kindness, because there was a reason behind it, he'd been poisoned.
Wow.
And that changed my view of, maybe the man really did need money. He told me, he said, I can walk to Taco Bell and get fresh food, where somebody could give me a bag of food and it may have poison in it. It was because a lot of people hate the homeless.
Talk about the world that we live in, such things. So, some other verses to consider. Hosea 11 talks about how God leads us with cords of kindness. Another act of kindness is in the process of, as people are maturing and growing, here is God, and He wants us to become more mature. He wants us to grow. How often must it be that God sees us go through the learning process, and it would be so easy for Him to just go, oh, I'm wasting my time on these people. So patience with people through the growing process is an act of kindness, isn't it? We all need time to mature. Proverbs 31 says, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. This is speaking of the worthy woman of Proverbs 31. She's wise, and her teaching is kind. Right? So how I speak to people, the way that I approach them when there's a disagreement, right? You may very well be right, but we can win the battle but lose the war because we were right and we knew it and we forced our point, but there was no kindness on our tongue. So there's another way that we can show kindness. So then let's we're running low on time here. The third one, which is to walk humbly with your God. So you have three things. And this is what I love about Micah 6:8 is it's simple, right? What does it mean to be good? Well, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Verse we brought up last night is Ecclesiastes 5. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. For they do not know that they are doing evil. We run into this in terms of worship today. New Testament worship, very simple, right? We just see 5 things that are done in the New Testament. We see them praying, we see them singing, and it's a cappella singing, just singing, no instruments, melodies in their heart. We see teaching, we see taking the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, and we see giving once a week. All very, very simple things. Has anybody in any religion ever embellished upon those to try and make it fancier? That's like all we do, right? So now worship, we say, well, let's not just sing, let's add piano, and that's even an archaic thing, because really, if you were to go into a church building now and they just had a piano, they would consider that an old-timey worship, right? So now we've amped it up, literally, with amps and guitars and lights and sound, and there's the phrase now is worshiptainment that is kind of been coined to explain this sense of almost frenetic energy that we're trying to get into a worship service. And do they know that they're doing evil when they do that? I don't believe so. There's a woman that we're studying with. She's started coming to these Bible classes that we have in a coffee shop on Wednesday mornings, and she attends one of the largest community churches in the area. I mean, we're about 5,000-6,000 people. And I asked her, well, why do you go there? She goes, I walked in, and I'm just overwhelmed with emotion when I walked in. There's the building, and then just walking into the building and the sound of the worship music and everything, I just brought me to tears. I think she's entirely sincere with that. But that's not what God wants. She went into it with a mentality, and these churches are catering to that mentality of what do you want when Ecclesiastes says guard your steps and draw near to listen, better than to offer the sacrifice of fools. Isaiah 10, shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it, as if a rod should wield him who lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who is not wood. What are some ways we are no longer humble in our relationship to God as a society? Where we, as the axe, boast to the one who's wielding the axe. We're the tool and he's the maker. We're the creation, he's the creator. What are ways as a society now that we've lost that sense of humility?
One of the ways that I've heard a lot, kind of common in community church type movements, is the idea of talking to God like he's just your buddy.
And the man upstairs,
Yeah,
right? That kind of.
you know, it's like, as opposed to having the respect and reverence that he's different than us, and he's righteous and holy, and we're not.
Right.
Missing that sense of awe.
Yeah, so there's that sense of, we're almost back to that sacred conversation, right? Of the reverence that God is not us. What are other ways? I mean, think of any? Yes.
How we use our time. We think that our time is our own. So therefore, we try to use it all up. And how much of it do we spend with God?
Yeah. So under the Old Testament, when people were to give to God, the term that was used a lot was first fruits, right? When you are allocating time or resources, you give God the first fruits, and then whatever's left, I do what I please. We kind of do the opposite now, don't we? We say, okay, well, I've got what I want to do and the things that I want, and then with what's left, I'll give God whatever percentage is left over. If you add up the amount of time, if you just take, okay, one midweek class and then all day on Sunday kind of thing, just that alone, you're roughly looking at like 2% of your time gets spent in worship. It's a pretty small amount. And yet, realistically, how many Christians are consistent in even doing that 2%? So it is a humility issue. Yeah, I don't have time for that. Anybody else have any? Yeah.
Thinking our money.
Our money? Yeah. Right along the same lines. It's the allocation of what's mine, right? It's mine, and then I'll build my bigger barns, right? Yeah, absolutely. Isaiah 64, but now, O Lord, you are our Father, we are the clay, and you are potter, and all of us are the work of your hand. Do not be angry beyond measure, O Lord, nor remember iniquity forever. Behold, look now, all of us are your people. There is another woman that has been coming to some studies that we do at a senior center. And she's an older woman. She spent her whole life kind of hopping different churches. And I made a point about baptism being a requirement for salvation. I just kind of said it even in passing. That wasn't the whole point of what we were talking about that day. And she caught me and she said, well, wait a second, are you saying you need to be baptized to be saved? I said, well, yes. And she goes, well, I just feel that the important thing is confessing to God, praying that prayer to him and letting him know that you are sorry and that you want him in your life, which I would agree that it is important to confess God and your allegiance to him, that no doubt about it. She said, well, I think that's what's important. I just think baptism, probably you should do it, but I don't think it's necessary. What's the problem with that mentality? If I say, okay, here's a verse that says confess is necessary, but then we have verses that talk about the importance of baptism, and I like these ones but not these ones. What's the problem with that?
You don't get to selectively choose.
Right. There's the problem.
All Scripture is inspired of God.
Yeah, and if I'm going to selectively choose, then who has now become the authority? It's me, right? I've now decided this is what I think the process by which we become saved is. And I'm now in the driver's seat. And God can kind of be in the co-pilot seat. I'll let him give me advice from time to time. But ultimately the call is mine. And that's that humility issue that gets us into trouble so much of the time. So if you look at these three things, and we'll wrap up here, he has told you a man what is good, what does the Lord require of you? Do justice. We're going to do what's right. And by the way, that ties into the one we just covered. If I'm going to do what's right, who's going to tell us what's right? God is. And I'm going to be humble enough to accept his standard of what's right and wrong, not mine. And I'm going to love kindness. That is, if I have opportunity to do something beyond what is fair, I'm going to do it. Does it matter how big that thing is? No. So small acts of kindness are just as important in the eyes of God, who says that he sees all of those things. Even if your right hand doesn't know what your left hand is doing, he knows what both hands are doing. So he's fully aware of that. Okay, well then, we'll stop there. We'll take a short break, I think, and then pick up in a few minutes.